I'm here with Pieri Munro, the interim CEO of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Kia ora, Pieri, and thank you for your time today.
Kia ora.
You've been in the role during probably the worst natural disaster in Hawke's Bay. Can you give me an overview of the damage and destruction caused by Cyclone Gabrielle?
Overview. An overview. Probably the worst that we've ever suffered in recorded history. People have tried to make comparisons with Bola, but this, we believe, has significantly impacted Hawke's Bay. In particular areas, it's been variable as to where it's impacted. So like if you look at Napier City, where we're currently sited here, minimal impacts. But if you go a wee bit further south, down towards Rissington, down Puketapu, Puketitiri, up into the Esk Valley, up into Noyo, significant impacts. Pākowhai is another one. So it's been in particular areas where there's been devastation and quite severe. You know, we're talking about people, property, and about businesses.
Now, obviously, the Civil Defence Emergency Management Group handled the initial response, and there's a review into that. How do you think the response was?
I think so if we talk about the response, but we talk about the circumstance around that, a bit of context.
Yeah.
So on the 12th, the 13th, leading into the 14th, we certainly had some forecast information. And this exceeded all the forecast information and modelling and prediction that we were able to do off the top of that. I think an example of that is that in one of the areas where we were forecast for about 250, it topped out at about 501. And that's off our Glengarry site, one of our monitoring sites that we use for the Esk Valley area. So the forecast information we got, we did the best that we could in terms of modelling and predicting off that and responding in terms of certain actions to that. But the cyclone that we experienced on the night of the 13th and the 14th was somewhat different to that. So in terms of the response to that, I think our staff, both at the Civil Defence Headquarters, where we had lost cell phone networks, we had lost power, we had lost communications, I think did the level best. That said, we're well aware and we invite a review and an inquiry in terms of not only civil defence, and that's been processed at the moment, but also one that might be higher, and we're reliant upon ministers and upon government in terms of that.
When did you start getting information that it was much worse than you thought it was going to be?
Well, my understanding was that it actually changed to a red alert, but the actual forecast information itself hadn't changed. That was on the night of the 13th, leading to that. I think when we first got the alert was in the early morning of the 14th, when the rain had started to exceed what those predictions and that modelling had been telling us.
So what was your first course of action as CEO?
Well, our first course of action was to be in terms of the states of declaration that were given not only by Napier, but also by Hastings and also by regional. And then we had the national declaration state of emergency that came out as well. My role initially as CE was to stand up our initial responses to that. That was to ensure we have administrative responsibility for Hawke's Bay Civil Defence.
Yeah.
And so our role was to ensure that we had sufficient staff in there, both before, leading up to and through, and in the post-response areas. Also to stand up our own emergency operations centre here in terms of looking after our response on the ground, but also our BAU, our business as usual.
And what is the recovery, and what have you done as a council? Once again, overview kind of thing, because there's so much to talk about, I suppose. Yeah.
So earlier on I mentioned people, property, businesses.
Yeah.
That's our priority structure in terms of how we approach that. So we have 248 kilometres of stock bank. That's our primary across the Heretaunga Plains. We had about 5.3 of that was breached in terms of a cumulative aggregated distance of stock bank. We had about 23 kilometres of that were damaged in some way. So in terms of people's safety, our first response is to try and get that back to as it was. That's going to take us a whole year to get there. We normally have probably about 50 staff who have different maintenance jobs around that. We've got 170 staff. That includes contractors, includes people from outside who were brought in. We're running 17 teams across that to get those built back to as they were as quickly as possible.
And so, I mean, where do you even start with the cleanup? I mean, how did you prioritise that?
Well, the priority was around people, property, and then around businesses.
Yeah.
And that's about people's safety first and foremost.
Yeah.
So our one is the people that have been affected, those who might not have been affected on the fringes, they're concerned about their ongoing safety.
Yeah.
I've heard from others about how some are feeling quite anxious when it rains. And the rain's going to continue as we move into winter. So our first priority is about getting those stock banks up and running properly.
Yeah.
That's taken most of our resource at the moment. It's taken significant cost over and above what our regional council covers. So we're working closely with central government and with the recovery agency that has been set up to ensure that we can do that fast, and then we can move on in terms of other areas, whether that's about silt removal or other aspects.
So what personally shocked you about the cyclone?
Personally, me, I was not affected like others have been affected. And we've been going to some of the community meetings, and I've been upfront about that. But it's difficult for me to appreciate how they feel personally affected. These are people who have lost their homes, their incomes, who have been severely impacted in terms of their well-being. So for me, it's been able to see what the devastation has caused. And so I've gone out and had a look at that. It's been able to listen to people and what they're recounting and telling us about their experiences that early morning, trying to escape from their homes, trying to take their children and family to safety, trying to get up onto roofs so that they can be helicoptered out. So for me, probably, it's not so much about being shocked by it, but my greatest concern has been listening to other people and their stories and the impact it's had on them.
So talking about stock banks, much has been made of them and how effective or ineffective they were in parts. Was it a failure? Did the stock banks fail?
The stock banks were built for 1 in 100 probability. And there was one section down there at Tamatea and behind Pieri. That last year, at some cost, we were grateful for Kainoa funding, that we were able to build that to 1 in 500. That survived. If it had breached, we would have had flooding coming through here into Napier. So there's a distinction between the stock banks that existed and have been there for many decades, which were built for 1 in 100. That was probability based around, we understand what that means. Where we need to get to in terms of greater security and protection for people is to get those back up to 1 in 500. We will need central government support for that.
And do you think you will get that?
Well, I can't say really, but we're working very closely with the recovery agency. So our minister, our new minister, in terms of recovery, is Meka Whaitiri. And we're working with Sir Brian Roche as part of the task force and working with our Matariki governance group, who are looking at locally led, regionally enabled.
So one of your officials said that a digger contractor was on his way to one of the stop banks on the morning. And was it your intention for a section of the stop bank to be removed? Because that did create quite a bit of upset at a Pakawhā meeting.
I think what concerned us at the Pakawhā meeting were the allegations that we'd blown part of the stop bank.
Did you?
That was totally incorrect.
What were those noises then?
The noises?
That the people reported hearing all over the afternoon?
Well, I think there are people out there who report facts and there are people out there who don't. We did not blow any stop banks, categorically. But there was a certain part, and I think Chris, our General Manager of Infrastructure, he indicated there was one part there that they considered, which was an opening that was to allow water out. That would be controlled. It never eventuated.
Because it had already gone over by the time
I'm not sure about that. But
well, that's what came up at the meeting,
But the plan and the intention that Chris had referred to at Pakawhā that night never eventuated.
So where would that water have gone?
I don't know. I couldn't tell.
into Pakawhai or?
We really need to have Chris back here to be able to answer that. I can't answer that.
All right, because they got quite agitated and at that meeting about the council not warning them that they should evacuate. Were there options to evacuate people?
I think there were certainly some options based on the forecasting on the 13th, the day before.
Yeah.
And for some of those, we were able to sort of get that out. Now, unless you have a declared state of emergency, there are no powers to actually evacuate people, and that's using police and other first responders. So there was no state of declaration on the 13th. Yeah. What we did was said to people, look, it's significant what might be coming this way, and people voluntarily decided to actually evacuate. A good example is Hawke College. Yeah. We had 48 young ladies in there who chose to evacuate, as were other areas up in that area around Waipatiki. Yeah. Some of those chose to, some didn't, but we couldn't force them to evacuate.
Yeah. Now, your officials have faced a tough time at these community meetings, and the recent Pakawhai meeting saw one of your officials take some rather personal comments. What do you say about that?
I think for me, so if we reference that particular meeting and the meetings that have followed, so there was a meeting that followed out of Bayview. The structure of the meeting that followed provided greater value, I think, to the majority of people who were at the meeting. There were people there, like if I reflect on Pakawhai, there were probably 5 or 6 people who had the greater part of the audience and who were doing all the speaking. But there were a lot of people there who didn't. So the difference in terms of Bayview, which was the meeting to follow, in which Sandra and Hastings District Council team changed to, was to allow those people to come up and go to different agencies at their choice to be able to speak to them and raise their issues. So I attended Bayview, along with many of our councillors, and we had a great throng of people who came up to us to tell us about their stories, their concerns, questions that they had. It was a greater valued construct in terms of a community meeting. Since then, I've been to some of the ones down in Central Hawke's Bay, different construct. So I think if we manage the meetings in a way that allows the greater majority to be able to have their say, that's a good value meeting.
Now, situations like that and also your frontline staff, what are you doing as CEO to protect and safeguard them against sort of anger and that out there from people who are frustrated by the situation they're in? What are you doing to protect them?
So well-being of our staff is one of my priorities. It's one of my highest priorities. And I think from the outset, leading into the cyclone and in the early days of the response, the weeks to follow, we've been focused on that well-being. So my staff have always had access to EAP services, but also we're brought in 2 psychologists as well, who have been here on site and just allowing people to come and go as they please. Through our executive team and through our managers, we've been monitoring closely just to see if there's signs of people who are wavering a wee bit under this. We've also had some of our own staff who have been massively affected by that. We had someone who lost their farm up in Esk. We've had others who have been flooded. And so we've tried to give special attention to them, leave where they needed to go and clean their properties up. Well-being about our staff has been uppermost. It continues to be the case even today. I think one of the learnings we got from Christchurch was that you will lose your staff in the breach of an event, or you will lose your staff in the aftermath in the 18 months to follow. And our one is providing as much support and help and relief as we can.
Were there many incidents of frontline staff like digger drivers or whatever out there being abused by the public?
There have been some. There have been some, and we've tried to deal with those case by case. So the answer is yes.
Yeah. And now you took the steps a while back to issue that media release calling, after the Pakawhai meeting, calling for the disinformation to stop, and you've mentioned the blowing up of stop banks and saying you didn't do that. What other disinformation was there that you're concerned about?
I think that was probably one of our primary ones at the time that we responded to in the way that we did. We couldn't have that going on, as untruthful as it was, and arousing emotion across other communities and aspects, particularly as we continue to go to other meetings. So for us, we felt it was necessary to take that as a special case to respond in the way that we did, just to stop that sort of misinformation being circulated.
Now, a report you released yesterday about woody debris, most of it pine but not slash, you're saying. A lot of it's fallen trees and sort of catchment trees as well. Did that surprise you, that finding?
I think since I've had a couple of interviews since the 14th, and slash seems to have been one that's been brought in from more of an emotive sense.
Yeah.
And then behind that, sort of saying, okay, well, we need to look at forestry.
Yeah.
So for many weeks following that, I've known that slash was not a big issue in particular areas. So the report that we released yesterday looked at 17 sites all the way around the bay, and particularly those that are related to where we've got bridges and others that have collapsed. What we did find was probably about 1%, but up to about 9% in the Munro-Rissington area was where there was wood that appeared to have processing marks on it or had been cut on both faces. Now, there was one in particular, and that's up in Waidor. Waidor was one of the sites, Waidor River. Our survey and independent group that we contracted to do that work didn't actually land. It was a visual assessment. So we're keen in terms of the Waidor residents and Waidor District Council working with that community to better understand what the deposition was down on the Waidor River. It was only visual. There needed to be a follow-up to that. So there are some excerpts in the report that need to be looked at carefully, somewhere we need to follow up on.
Because is it just semantics? Because when is slash and when is a pine tree falling in a plantation, just a pine tree falling and being washed down? I mean...
So when we look at slash, we're talking about processed wood within a plantation that might be operating under the National Environmental Standard plantation forest. But when we're talking about some of the woody debris that was found down in the places that we've looked at, we had whole trees with root balls on the bottom that might have been debarked in the process of coming down as part of the river containment. So when we use slash, then there's a suggestion that this might have been forestry. What we have found is that only 1% of the debris that we looked at, or they looked at as part of that independent review, was slash. Minimal against the greater quantity.
Now, you've appointed a recovery manager within the council, Louise McPhail. What is her role going to be?
So, best to understand our recovery manager, because each of our 5 councils has appointed a recovery manager, as have some of the other communities and entities. And that's all part of actually bringing together what those impacts are, what the repairs, what the reconstruction might be, trying to quantify that so we can bring it together through the recovery agency framework and process. And ultimately, that will seek significant investment from central government for us to be able to get back onto our feet. When I say us, I'm talking about Hawke's Bay communities wide, including councils.
Now, obviously, you're working closely with the recovery agency, and there's a permanent. They've just announced the board and chair in that, and then there's a permanent role coming up for manager or whatever. Who do you think should be in that role, and are you interested in it?
No, I'm not interested in it. Let's answer that question first. But I think we need someone in there with competency, with experience, with knowledge. I will always err to best person for the job.
So who's that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Someone else will select that.
And are you doing more reviews into your handling of that?
Yes, we are.
What's that going to cover? What are the terms of reference for that?
So internally, we'll be doing our own review around our flood protection infrastructure. That includes the stock banks and certainly some of the schemes. In the main, that's going to be across Heretaunga Plains. Part of what we will be looking at, and this is part of our bid back into government, is looking to improve that or install flood protection schemes where we don't currently have them. An example is up Esk Valley, we have river maintenance, but we don't have flood protection per se. And there are other areas like that. Waidor is another case where we do a bit of river maintenance. And so last year, the year before, we did along where the playground is on the south side of Waidor. We reinstalled that. We put sheet piling in against the other side. That was just to hold the bank in terms of destabilisation on the roads. So that's the sort of work that we have done in the past where we have funding. Certainly what we're looking at is a flood protection that Whitehall might need moving ahead over the next few years. That'll be part of the bid that we'll put through for that. So there's a lot of work to be done. What we're talking about is months and months and months of recovery work. The example is just to restore back to 1 in 100 on our stock banks will take us a year. And that's working at the pace that we're working with triple the team that we would normally have.
Is there going to be any assessment of where our rivers go? Because there's an example of the Waipawa River, which reverted back to a path that it was on 150 years ago. Has man sort of altered, have we altered the rivers too much in parts? And is there going to be an overview of how the system works?
Whether we've altered them too much, I possibly won't answer. Yeah. But what I will say is that, yes, we have altered the natural course. And so part of this is going back in history in terms of understanding that. You know, like I even know that within Māori history, particularly locally here, they had great understanding of places where they wouldn't perhaps build or they wouldn't put their marae. Yeah. And part of it is understanding and bringing all that information together. What we are doing now, and this is part of where we've altered in terms of moving river courses in a different direction, is the flood bank infrastructure that we currently have. Yeah. We want to get that back as it was, first and foremost, and then we're hopeful that with supported funding we can actually build them to another level.
So now this is an interim role for you and a new CEO has been appointed, Dr. Nick Peat. Just tell us a bit about him, and you're happy that he's coming on board? I suppose you're relieved to be out of the top job now, yeah?
It's been an experience. There was a convergence, so I came to it at the same time that the cyclone happened. So you weren't in a position to back out. You have to do the best. And I think for me, part of that has been acknowledging just the executive team that we have here and acknowledging our 340, 350 odd staff. We've got a few more now as a result of this. But acknowledging our staff. We've got very capable staff, staff that have stayed with us throughout this. I'm hoping they will stay beyond this. In terms of Dr. Nick Peat, I've known Dr. Nick Peat for many years now in a previous life. He's great. And he's someone that will certainly fit the bill for us here in Hawke's Bay and take us forward. My understanding of Nick is that he's high intellect. He's very capable. He's a listening person. So we're looking forward to him. There's two things I'd highlight here. One is having someone who's got technical experience coming into the role. Nick certainly has that. He's been under a very good lead down there in Horizons, so he comes from good stock. Yeah. And prior to that, he was part of conservation. So there's that technical expertise. I think the other part that he brings with him is his people focus. Yeah. And that's what we need for our people here at Hawke's Bay Regional Council.
And what are you going to do? Go back to your old job?
Don't say old. I'm going to go back to my Te Pū Whakarai role. Yeah. And the importance of that, because I've been missing them and they've been missing me, so we've got 5 in total in our small team here, but we network across the other 4 councils, so we have about 16 or 17 FTEs that are all pulling in the same direction. There's something in common about that, and that is we all serve the same piece of land, although they might have district areas. We all serve the same people and communities, and we have really good relationships with mana whenua, tangata whenua. So I'm keen to get back there because that is an important part to play in terms of our recovery moving forward.
Yeah, because it's taken on new significance, and obviously maraes and iwi and hapu were quite badly affected by this. So it's important for you to get back in there.
Well, it is. Because, like we have a Māori Committee of Council, it's a Schedule 7 committee, and they've been with us for almost 30 years, supporting council in its business from the catchment days. But we also are unique that we are the only regional council that have a legislative part in terms of the Regional Planning Committee that has its own Act 2015. And part of that is acknowledging the play that not only perhaps Tai Whenua have through the Māori Committee, but also post-settlement governance entities. We have 9 of those across our region. So they have a significant part to play not only now, but in the future moving forward. We look forward to that.
Nami, Pieri, Munro, and all the best for the future.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.